Hi, it's Tessa. In this week's video, we're going to be painting this dog eye. I got the reference off of Unsplash, and I decided to focus in just on the eye for this lesson. Before getting started, I wanted to do a little warm-up exercise. This is to play around with the saturation of paint inside my brush, which gets different effects. First, draw out 3 small circles. I just did this on a scrap piece of paper. I'm using a puddle of paint from my palette that's about a milky consistency. It's diluted enough to have some good flow, but there's still enough pigment to give me a dark color. For the first circle, I make sure that I fully saturate my brush for each stroke. After I'm done filling in this shape, I make sure that it's still fully saturated with pigment. For the second shape, I'm using the same puddle of paint on my palette, but this time I'm spreading a smaller amount of paint over my area. When this dries, you're going to notice very different values on each of these shapes, even though they were painted with the same consistency of paint. Because more paint was used in the first shape, more pigment is left to dry on the paper. Because the second shape had paint that was spread very thin, the value turns out a lot lighter. On this third shape, my goal is to make a furry texture all around the edges of the circle. I fill in the full circle like I was painting my first shape. I want to have some excess moisture so that my edges don't dry before I finish painting the texture. Once this shape is fully filled out, I wipe off my brush so that it doesn't have very much paint on it. I take some of the excess paint from the circle and I flick it out to create a furry texture. Certain hand positions are a lot more comfortable to make this texture than others. Because I'm left-handed, pulling the brush down into the left is the more comfortable position for me. It's a good idea to turn your paper as you're working so that your hand is always in this comfortable position. I also want to practice these flicking brush texture marks in isolation. To start, I use a fully saturated brush. Notice how it leaves a bit of a bead on the paper. Like our first shape that we did, this bead will dry and leave darker marks. It will also be a little less fine. I do a second patch of these marks, focusing on making sure there's only just enough paint on my brush. I don't want it to be fully saturated with paint. I just want enough to get a flowing mark. To get this level of moisture on your brush, you might need to swipe it against your palette to get off extra droplets, or you can also dab it on a towel. For this third patch, I'm going even a step farther and using dry brush. This can be a really good technique for certain textures, but today I really want to focus on that middle patch, getting just the right amount of moisture on my brush. This is going to help us as we paint the texture of the fur around this dog's eye. To draw the eye, I start out with a circle. Even though the shape of the eye through the lids will not be a circle, I like to start with this base shape, and then draw the eyelids on top of the circle I already made. In some areas, the eyelids I'm drawing overlap the circle and cover the eyeball. In areas like the corner of the eye, this eyelid actually goes beyond the eyeball. When I'm mapping out areas that I know are going to be that raggedy fur texture, I make sure to not draw straight lines with my pencil. Instead, I do little hatching marks that follow the direction of the hair growth. Keeping these marks light and separated will help the pencil marks blend in underneath your painting. When I'm happy with the placement of everything, I go in with a mechanical pencil and I darken some of my marks. Now this is ready to paint. For this painting, I'm only using 3 colors: phthalo blue, burnt sienna, and Payne's gray. I'll start by mixing 2 puddles of very watery paint. one with just phthalo blue, and another one with phthalo blue and burnt sienna mixed together. This creates kind of a grayish green color. Starting in the middle of my drawing, I paint the entire eyeball with my phthalo blue. Then with my grayish mixture, I paint the skin around the eye. Everything is still wet, so the gray might blend into the blue a little bit. To keep better control of this, I make sure not to lift up my brush right next to the blue. I take a moment to grab some thicker blue paint straight out of my well, and I paint the pupil as well as the ring around the iris. Alternating between my gray mixture, a little extra burnt sienna, and clean water, I paint out beyond the borders of my drawing. Here's where I focus on getting that fur texture. Before this dries completely, I take some thicker burnt sienna and I paint the skin around the eye. I let this completely dry, and I mix a slightly darker gray mixture with my burnt sienna and my phthalo blue. With this mixture, I paint the dark fur around the eye. Now, using pure phthalo blue, I paint the shadow that was cast onto the eyeball and the dark blue areas of the eye. For this painting, I'm focusing on not using much blending. Instead of blending, I use a broken edge to soften that area between the blue and the white of the eye. The skin in the corner of the eyes is still too light, so I take a grayish mixture, but make it a little more brown. I paint this over the dark fur from my last layer, as well as the corners of the eye. When I finish painting that shape, I realize some areas can go darker, and so I drop some brown and Payne's gray into that wet color. Before this dries completely, I decide to lift out a little highlight in the corner of the eye. With a clean brush that I've dried on my towel, I pick up the area that I see lighter on the photo. I swipe across the still damp paint to lift up some extra pigment where I want things to be a little lighter. Now that I have a couple good base layers over the whole painting, I take things section by section to start darkening. Every time I paint the fur around the eye, I make sure that I'm using that texture from our warm-up. As I continue refining this painting, I start using thicker mixtures of color and painting with smaller brush marks. Once I have everything as dark as I want it, I decide I want to add a little gouache. Gouache is helpful because it's an opaque medium, meaning if I want areas lighter, I can paint those right on top of the watercolor underneath. There are some fine, light hairs above the eye that I painted over with watercolor at the start. So I take some titanium white gouache and I mix it with the gray mixture I had earlier to darken it a little bit. These fine hairs aren't the focal point of the painting, so I don't want to use pure white. That would add a little more contrast than I want in this part of the painting. It's important to me to keep these lines very fine, and to do that, I need to make sure that I've controlled the amount of paint on my brush. Using the same flicking motion that I've used for the rest of the painting, I add individual hairs with this lighter color. My last step is to add the highlights to the eye. I started first by mixing white with phthalo blue from my watercolor palette. I used this light blue as a base for those highlights. When that base is dry, I go in with pure white to add the final shiny highlights on the eye. I hope you give this exercise a try. It's great practice in learning how to start layering your watercolors. This is also a great warm-up for practicing a larger portrait. Animal portraits can get really complicated, and it helps so much to break things down into simpler subjects. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.